In 2003, the National Academy of Sciences and the FDA did a joint study in which they found that every freshwater fish in America had dangerous levels of mercury in its flesh. And the mercury was coming from coal-burning power plants and cement kilns mainly. And so we started suing them, and I had about 40 lawsuits against these power plants for mercury discharges. And women started coming up to me. I was speaking all around the country about this. Women started coming to these, almost every speech I did, and they'd sit in the front row, and they'd wait till the end, and then they'd come up to me and ask to talk to me, and they were very respectful, but they would gently scold me about mercury in the vaccines. All of them were women, as it turns out, who had children with intellectual disabilities, and they believed their children had been injured by vaccines. And this was something I didn't want to do, I didn't want to get into, but one of them showed up at my house in Massachusetts, a woman, a psychologist named Sarah Bridges from Minnesota, and she came to my home. She had a son who had received $20 million from the vaccine court, forgetting the vaccine court had found that he had gotten autism from a vaccine. She came to my home with a pile of studies, 18 inches thick. She found my home. She put it on the front porch. She rang the doorbell, and when I came to the door, she pointed to it, and she said, "I'm not leaving here till you read these studies." And I'm accustomed to reading science. That's what I do for a living. All the lawsuits that I brought have involved scientific controversies, and all of them involve a process of reading the science critically and then cross-examining proponents of that science, direct examining people who are differing with it. And I read this before I got 6 inches down in this pile. I was reading the abstracts. I was just dumbstruck by the giant delta between what the public agencies were saying about vaccine safety and what the actual science was saying. And I saw somebody was lying. And I decided I had to listen to these mothers. And I started investigating this issue and finding all kinds of holes in it. And this was the decision that really ruined my life in many ways. But I saw that our children were sick. Now, I had 11 siblings. I had 70 first cousins. And I never knew anybody with a peanut allergy. And I was asking, why do 5 of my 7 kids have life-threatening allergies? And I started seeing this all around and wondering why nobody was talking about it. The autism rates in my generation and 70-year-old men are between, depending on what study you read, are between 1 in 10,000 and 1 in 1,500 today, right now, in 70-year-old men. The autism rates in my children are 1 in every 34, according to CDC, and in some states, like California, 1 in 22. And I was astonished that nobody else was taking notice of this, that there'd been a huge change. You mentioned in your introduction that there's this story that this is genetic. Well, I knew enough about science to know that genes do not cause epidemics. They may provide a vulnerability, but you need an environmental toxin. Something had happened to our kids, and we saw these giant explosions of neurological diseases, ADD, ADHD, speech delay, language delay, tics, sleeping disorders, Tourette's syndrome, narcolepsy, ASD, autism, autoimmune diseases like juvenile diabetes and rheumatoid arthritis. When I was a kid, the average pediatrician would see 1 case of diabetes in his lifetime over a 40 or 50-year career. In my kids' generation, 1 out of every 3 kids who walks through a pediatrician door today has diabetes or is pre-diabetic. And we're spending more on our military expenditures. We're spending more on diabetes, mitochondrial disorders, than we are on the military. The total cost, when my uncle was president, about 6% of Americans had chronic disease. Today, the latest study, NIH stopped doing this tabulation, but the last time they did it was in 2006, and 54% of Americans, kids, now have chronic disease. It's probably up to 60 today, 60%. We've gone from 6% to 60%. The entire cost of treating chronic disease when my uncle was president, I was 10 years old, was zero. Zero. There weren't even drugs to treat it. Today, it's $4.3 trillion. So we are bankrupting this country. 77% of American kids are too disabled to qualify for military service. It affects our economy, it affects our national security, it affects our national morale. And then the allergic disease, like I never knew anybody with peanut allergy when I was a kid. I never knew anybody with food allergies. Today, there are EpiPens in every classroom. We all know kids with peanut allergies. And I'll tell you something, that Congress said to EPA, tell us what year the autism epidemic began. And the EPA came in. EPA is a captive agency, but it's captive by the oil companies and the coal companies and the chemical companies, not by food and not by pharma, because it doesn't regulate them. So it actually did an honest study, and it came back and said in 1989, it is a red line that was the change year. Well, that year changed a lot of other things. The food allergies suddenly appeared, the autoimmune diseases suddenly became prevalent, and these neurological diseases suddenly exploded, and obesity began exploding. So something happened during that period of time that changed the profile, and today, Americans have a higher chronic disease burden than any nation in the world. I'll say one last thing. During a New York Times reporter interviewed me, a health reporter who I've never talked to before, and says she's going to do a fair article. She's doing an article because the Times is scared that I may get a post in the Trump administration that is going to put me in having something to do with health policies. And she asked me about this, and I said, look, the only thing I want is I want evidence-based science, and we don't have that today. We don't have evidence-based medicine anymore. The medical treatments and the medical decisions and policies are based upon the mercantile interests of these giant companies that now control our public health agencies. And that has to be changed. During COVID, we had the highest death rate of any nation in the world, the highest body count. We had 16% of the COVID deaths in the United States. We only have 4.2% of the global population. So, and why are people getting awards for this? We literally did worse than any country in the world. And CDC said, well, it's not our problem. It's not our fault. It's the fault of the American people because they're so sick. The CDC said the average American who died from COVID had 3.8 chronic diseases. So they had asthma, they had obesity, diabetes, and one other thing. And this New York Times reporter says people in the medical community are scared that you're going to turn the attention away from infectious disease. And I said to her, we haven't had a pandemic in 100 years prior to COVID. And in COVID, and 95% of the deaths, 70% of the deaths worldwide are from chronic disease. 95% of the deaths in our country are from chronic disease. COVID, the people were actually dying, according to CDC, not from COVID. Healthy people didn't die from COVID. They were dying from chronic disease. And we need to change America's policies so that we identify what the origins are, what the etiology is, what the causes are of chronic disease, and we eliminate those and make ourselves healthy again.